In the early hours of March 15, 1862, the house slaves of Willowbrook Plantation found Colonel Benjamin Harrison Ashford chained in the slave quarters. His fine linen clothes were torn, his face marked with dried tears and blood. But that wasn't what paralyzed 40 witnesses that cold Georgia morning. It was the fact that his wife, Catherine Rose Ashford, wearing only her nightgown and barefoot, was holding the chains with her own hands. Her gaze showed no madness. It showed calculated, methodical, devastating fury, and beside her, hanging from a wooden beam like a hunting trophy, was the bloodied body of a young slave, only 23 years old. But what no one knew yet was that this body wasn't just any slave. It was Elijah, the only man the colonel had ever truly loved. And what the plantation elite would pay fortunes to hide was that, on that night, Catherine didn't just discover a betrayal. She discovered a secret that would shake the foundations of power, Protestant morality, and slavery itself. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and write in the comments which country you're watching this video from. Comment where you're watching from. What you're about to hear is what the history books tried to hide. Savannah, Georgia, May 1850. The slave market operated every Thursday at the City Exchange, right after the 7 o'clock church service. The smell of tobacco from nearby warehouses mixed with the acrid odor of sweating bodies packed under the merciless sun. It was spring, but the heat already foretold the brutal summer to come. The white magnolias surrounding the square perfumed the air with a sweetness that cruelly contrasted with the despair of human auctions. Colonel Benjamin Harrison Ashford was 47 years old that morning. Tall with well-trimmed mustache and penetrating gaze, he represented everything the American South considered respectable. His plantation produced over 5,000 bales of cotton per year. His name was known in Charleston parlors, at Richmond receptions, in dinners with senators and judges. His marriage to Catherine Rose Beaumont, daughter of a prominent Virginia family with connections to founding fathers, had been arranged for political and commercial interests. They had 3 daughters, all educated in Boston, finishing schools, but they had no love. Benjamin wasn't there to buy hands for the fields. His plantation already had 300 slaves working the cotton fields. He was looking for someone to work in the main house, someone who could care for his private library, organize correspondence, perhaps teach his daughters their first letters when they returned from the north. That's when the auctioneer announced Lot 23. Elijah was 20 years old. His skin was the color of burnt caramel. His green eyes shone like emeralds under the morning light. There was something about him that didn't fit the pattern of other slaves. His movements were delicate, almost feline. His posture, even chained, maintained a dignity that seemed to defy the very system enslaving him. And when he raised his gaze for a split second, his eyes met the colonel's. In that instant, something inexplicable pierced Benjamin's chest. It wasn't pity. It wasn't just curiosity. It was a visceral recognition, as if that young man were a mirror reflecting a part of himself he had buried for decades. The auctioneer explained that Elijah had been taught to read by his former mistress, the widow of a ship captain who died without heirs. The local reverend had considered it heresy, and the property was confiscated by creditors, who now sold the assets to cover debts. Elijah could read, write, and had knowledge of Latin. He mastered music and played piano. Lot 23, house slave, literate, 20 years old, starting bid $800. There was an awkward silence. Literate slaves were considered dangerous. They could forge documents, write passes for runaways, teach other slaves. Most buyers stepped back, murmuring disapprovals. $800, Benjamin said firmly. No one else bid. The gavel struck 3 times. Sold to Colonel Ashford of Willowbrook. As he signed the purchase papers, Benjamin felt his hands trembling. He couldn't explain why. He only knew he had just bought something far more complex than a simple slave. He had just brought into his house the beginning of his own destruction. The first months were an adjustment. Elijah was installed in small quarters at the back of the main house, separated from the slave cabins. His duties were clear: organize the library, handle the colonel's correspondence, maintain the plantation account books in order. Catherine was suspicious from the start, not of the nature of the relationship, not yet, but of the attention her husband gave that slave. Benjamin insisted that Elijah dine at the same table when they worked late in the study. He allowed the young man to wear finer clothes than other slaves. Even the way he spoke to him was different, without the automatic harshness that characterized orders to other captives. "You're spoiling that Negro," Catherine commented one evening while embroidering in the parlor. The other slaves will start questioning why he has privileges. Elijah has a brilliant mind, Benjamin replied without looking up from his newspaper. It would be wasteful to treat him like a field hand. Catherine didn't insist, but she stored that conversation in her memory. The nights became Benjamin's refuge. After dinner, when Catherine retired to her chambers, he would go down to the study and call for Elijah. They began discussing commercial correspondence, then moved on to reading together. First came the classics Benjamin had kept since his seminary days, Virgil, Ovid, Cicero. Then came the French philosophers that circulated clandestinely among the southern elite, Rousseau, Voltaire, Diderot. One night, while reading a passage from Montesquieu about laws and liberty, Elijah made an observation that paralyzed the colonel. "Do you truly believe natural laws of liberty exist, sir, or only laws that suit the powerful?" Benjamin slowly closed the book. "Why do you ask that?" "Because if natural laws exist, sir, then slavery is an aberration. But if they're merely conventions of the powerful, then there's no morality, only force. And if there's no morality," Elijah paused, "then everything we do is equally valid or equally condemnable, depending only on who has the power to judge." The depth of those words shook Benjamin. He spent the entire night thinking about it. Elijah didn't speak like a slave. He spoke like an equal, like someone who saw through social masks and understood the arbitrariness of everything. The conversations deepened. Philosophy, religion, morality, desire. They began talking about Plato and idealized love, about forbidden writings that circulated about relationships between men in ancient Greece, about the nature of love that the church condemned but poets secretly celebrated. One August night, while rain hammered against the window panes, Elijah read aloud a Shakespeare sonnet. His voice was melodious, each word pronounced with a delicacy that brought the text to life. When he finished, there was a heavy silence. "Do you understand what this poem really speaks of, Elijah?" "It speaks of impossible love, sir, of desiring what the world forbids." "And what does the world forbid you?" Elijah raised his eyes. For the first time, he didn't lower his gaze when his eyes met the colonel's. "Everything, sir. The world forbids me from existing as I am, forces me to be property, thing, shadow. But inside me," his voice trembled, "inside me, I know I'm more than that." Benjamin felt his heart race. He stood from the armchair and walked to the window, his trembling hands gripping the curtain. The rain outside was violent, relentless. "Do you know why I bought you that day, Elijah?" "No, sir." Benjamin closed his eyes. "Because when I looked at you, I saw something that has always been inside me. Something I spent 47 years trying to destroy, bury, deny. And suddenly, there you were, free of all hypocrisy, carrying in your body and gaze what I never had the courage to be." The silence that followed was interrupted only by the sound of rain. Elijah stood slowly. He took 2 steps toward the colonel, stopped just inches away. "And what are you, sir, if we removed all the masks?" Benjamin turned. Their faces were so close they could feel each other's breath. "I'm a coward," he whispered. "A man who sold his soul in exchange for titles and land, who married a woman he doesn't love, who had daughters he barely knows, who built an empire on others' suffering, and who now, for the first time in decades, feels alive." Elijah slowly raised his hand, as if asking silent permission. When Benjamin didn't pull away, he touched his face with infinite delicacy. "Then be alive, sir, even if only here, only now, only with me." And it was that night, under the sound of the storm washing over Georgia, that Colonel Benjamin Harrison Ashford allowed himself to feel what he had denied his entire life. But outside the door, a shadow listened. Mammy Ruth, Catherine's personal slave, had trained ears and absolute loyalty to her mistress, and what she had heard that night would be worth more than any treasure. For 8 years, Benjamin and Elijah maintained their relationship in the shadows. The colonel had become another man. Where there had been coldness, now there was warmth. Where there had been cynicism, now there was poetry. He began questioning slavery itself, even freeing some older slaves, to the astonishment of other plantation owners. Catherine noticed the changes but attributed everything to a midlife crisis. Benjamin traveled less to Charleston, declined invitations to balls, spent more time on the plantation. She imagined he might be ill, perhaps planning succession of the property. She never imagined the truth. But Mammy Ruth knew, and she waited for the right moment. That moment came in February 1862, when Catherine discovered that Benjamin planned to include Elijah in his will as a freed man with rights to a small property and a sum of money. The document was being drafted in secret by a lawyer from Atlanta, but Ruth, always attentive, had intercepted a letter. Catherine burst into her husband's study like a hurricane. "What does this mean?" she screamed, throwing the letter onto the desk. Benjamin paled. "Where did you get that?" "It doesn't matter. You intend to give land and freedom to a slave, to him specifically. Why?" "Elijah has served me well for years. He deserves—" "Deserves? A slave deserves nothing beyond what I allow. And you—" Catherine approached, her face contorted with rage. "You treat him as if he were family, as if he were more than me, more than your own daughters. It's not like that." "Then explain it to me. Explain why this Negro has privileges our children don't have, why you spend entire nights locked with him in this study, why your clothes smell of him when you return." The silence was deafening. Catherine stepped back, her face pale. The truth, that unimaginable truth, began to take shape in her mind. "No, it's not possible." Benjamin couldn't respond. His eyes betrayed everything. "Good Lord," Catherine whispered. "You, with a man, with a slave." Her voice rose. "With a male slave!" The lady stumbled, leaning on the desk. Then, as if a cold decision took control of her mind, she straightened. Her face returned to aristocratic composure, but her eyes shone with something far worse than anger. They shone with deadly determination. "You've shamed me, Benjamin, destroyed our name, condemned our daughters. And for what? For an abomination, a thing that shouldn't even exist." She walked to the door. "But I'm going to fix this. I'm going to erase this stain, and you're going to learn what honor means." That night, Catherine gathered the trusted overseers. She offered them money and whiskey, and ordered them to bring Elijah to the main slave quarters. When Benjamin found out, it was already too late. Benjamin ran to the slave quarters under the faint light of the waning moon. What he saw froze his blood. Elijah was hanging from a wooden beam, wrists tied above his head. His body was marked by lashes, blood running down his back, but he was still alive, breathing with difficulty. And there, standing in the center of the quarters, was Catherine. She held a bloodied whip in one hand and a bottle of whiskey in the other. Around them 40 slaves were forced to watch, as witnesses to a lesson they should never forget. "Catherine, for God's sake!" Benjamin shouted. "For God's sake!" She laughed, a joyless laugh. "It was in God's name I did this, to cleanse the sin you brought into my house." Benjamin tried to run to Elijah, but the overseers held him. "Let me go. I'm the colonel." "You're nothing," Catherine said with contempt. "You're just a weak man who let himself be seduced by the devil. But I'm going to save your soul, and I'll start by eliminating the temptation." She made a gesture. One of the overseers brought a brazier with red-hot irons. "No!" Benjamin fought against the men holding him. "Catherine, don't do this, I beg you." Elijah opened his eyes. Even through the pain, his gaze found Benjamin's, and in that moment, without words, they said everything they needed to. There was no regret, only love. "Do it," Elijah said in a weak but clear voice. "It won't change anything. What I feel can't be burned." Catherine froze. That courage, that dignity coming from a beaten slave, left her speechless. That's when Mammy Ruth, the slave who had denounced everything, stepped forward. "Mrs. the other plantation owners will know. 40 slaves are watching. The news will spread." Catherine looked around. The slaves lowered their eyes, but she knew Ruth was right. This was too big to hide. "Then let them know," she said coldly. "Let them know what happens to those who defy the natural order." She raised the hot iron, but before she could approach Elijah, Benjamin did something no one expected. With brutal force born of desperation, he broke free from the overseers. He ran to Catherine and tore the iron from her hands. Then, before everyone, he turned and pressed it against the chains holding Elijah, melting them. Elijah fell to the ground. Benjamin caught him in his arms. "Run!" he shouted to the slaves. "Flee! All of you! I free you!" Chaos erupted. Some slaves ran. Others stood paralyzed. The overseers didn't know whether to obey the colonel or his wife. Catherine screamed contradictory orders. In the confusion, Benjamin carried Elijah out of the quarters. He ran toward the stables, knowing it was their only chance. But Elijah was too weak. Blood poured in torrents. He knew he wouldn't survive. "Leave me," he whispered. "Save yourself." "No," Benjamin pressed him against his chest. "I won't leave you, never." Elijah smiled, a sad and beautiful smile. "Then we'll die together. That way, at least once, we'll be equals." They hid in the cotton gin house, an abandoned building at the back of the property. There, under the faint light of a candle Benjamin managed to light, Elijah spent his final hours. "Are you afraid?" Benjamin asked, holding his hand. No, not when I'm with you. Elijah coughed blood. You know what hurts. It's not dying. It's knowing you'll be alone again, that you'll go back to being that empty man. I won't. I promise I won't. Elijah raised his hand and touched Benjamin's face. Then do something for me. Live. Live openly, even if it costs everything. Show the world that the love we felt wasn't shame. It was the only true thing amid so many lies. How? How can I live without you? By loving, by being free, by being who you really are. Elijah closed his eyes. And if you do that, then nothing we went through will have been in vain. I will have freed you the same way you tried to free me. Benjamin held Elijah until his last breath. When he felt the body go limp, something inside him broke. It wasn't just pain, it was a transformation. He understood in that moment that Elijah was right. The only way to honor that love was to refuse to hide it. He took the candle and walked back to the main house. When dawn broke on March 15, 1862, Savannah's elite woke to news that would spread throughout the South like wildfire. Colonel Benjamin Harrison Ashford had chained himself in the slave quarters, wearing Elijah's bloodied clothes, and on every wall, written with charcoal, he had left a message that no amount of whitewash could completely erase. I, Benjamin Harrison Ashford, Colonel of Willowbrook, declare before God and man, I loved Elijah as no man should love another, according to the laws of this world. But I discovered that the laws of this world were made to preserve lies. I die loving what the South commanded me to hate, and if this is sin, let God judge me, for men have already shown they lack the moral authority to do so. Catherine ordered everything destroyed, but it was too late. 40 slaves had witnessed it. The story spread through plantations, through cities, reached Charleston and Richmond. It became whispers in parlors, scandal in newspapers, subject of fiery sermons in churches. In the following months, something unexpected happened. Some abolitionists began using the story as an example of slavery's moral corruption, not because of love between two men, but because the system created situations where love of any kind was impossible. Doctors debated, philosophers wrote, poets, in secret, created verses. Catherine lived 30 more years, always dressed in black, always in silence. She never remarried, never spoke of that night. Her daughters returned from Boston and married cotton merchants, but the Ashford name never recovered its former prestige. As for Benjamin and Elijah, their bodies were buried separately, as the law mandated. But decades later, when slavery was abolished and Reconstruction began, a group of former Willowbrook slaves, led by an old man who had been an overseer that tragic night, secretly exhumed both bodies and buried them together in an abandoned chapel in rural Georgia. They carved a simple headstone. Here rest two souls who loved when loving was forbidden. May their courage remind us, freedom begins when we stop being afraid of who we are. In 1950, when researchers found documents and letters hidden in the walls of the old plantation, they discovered that Benjamin had written for years a kind of philosophical diary where he questioned everything: slavery, arranged marriage, Protestant morality, the very nature of love and desire. These texts, published decades later under the title Confessions of a Colonel, became objects of study to understand not only the complexity of emotional relationships in the antebellum South, but also the contradictions of an elite that preached morality while profiting from the destruction of human lives. The story of Benjamin and Elijah reminds us that true love has always existed, even in the most unlikely places, even under the heaviest chains, and that sometimes those who seem to have all the power are in fact the most imprisoned. The love that the plantation aristocracy tried to burn in their furnaces became ashes that fertilized the seeds of abolition, because every time we try to destroy love, it's reborn, transformed into freedom. And you? Would you have the courage to love against the rules? To live your truth even if the whole world turned against you? Leave your opinion in the comments. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more stories that time tried to erase, but humanity insists on remembering.